Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sharik Abdul Ghani. I am the director of Minaret Foundation, where our focus is to lift American Muslim voices for sustainable change through multi-faith and civic engagement. Today, we are joined by Bibi Khan, the founder and director of An-Nisa Hope Center, and our esteemed guest, District Attorney, the Honorable Kim Ogg of Harris County. And we are continuing our candidate Q&A sessions, where every week we interview different folks running for positions within Harris County, Fort Bend County, and state level positions as well. Bibi Khan, Ms. Ogg, welcome.
Thank you, Sharik, and it's a pleasure to be here. So I'm Bibi Khan, and I'm with An-Nisa, and what we do is really help women and families in crisis, mainly domestic violence. So it's a pleasure to be here with you and Kim.
Kim, if we want to just jump right into it, as Chris Wallace said the other night in the debacle, the debate. Kim, would you like to tell us a little bit more about your platform?
Sure. I'm Kim Ogg. I'm your Harris County District Attorney. We're the third most populous county in the country, serving about 4.7 million. And of course, we're our neighbor, Fort Bend, is the fastest growing county, I think, still in Texas and perhaps in the country. It was at one time. We seem to be spreading regionally in terms of the impact that our policies are having, especially when it comes to drug enforcement and police accountability. And so my platform is simple. It's equal justice. There can be no double standards. Everyone lives under the same set of laws. And we are evidence-based, meaning we either have the evidence to go forward on a criminal case or we don't. I trust the community with the results. I do not believe the district attorney's job is to engineer convictions. I think our job is to gather and present evidence to the community. And that happens in the form of grand juries and juries. And then it's up to the community to participate in their democracy through jury service. And when things happen in front of them, through witnessing and being willing to utilize our policing and justice system to maintain order in our communities. And what we are dedicated to do is doing that fairly and doing it based on evidence, not relationships or non-evidentiary reasons like political reasons. So it's a simple platform, and in practice, we handle about 100,000 cases per year. So have under 800 employees, about 767, about half of them are lawyers. So we have enormous caseloads. And what I want the public to know is, while it's not part of my platform, to take pride in a group of employees and public servants that works as hard as our assistant DAs and our support staff do. And I think it's truly a desire to serve the community that drives that. They could all go home at 5. And of course, we're all working from home to some degree right now, but they don't. They work all the time. They work for justice, and they are a great asset to our community. And the platform for re-election is, I think we need another term to continue to stabilize the many changes that are occurring within the justice system now. And we want them to compromise public safety, and yet we want significant change. And so balancing that and doing it in an operationally sound way is what the next 4 years will be consumed with.
Thank you. And Bibi, if I could ask you to start with our first round of questions.
Okay, great. So when I first met you, you were just recently elected to your position. And I remember meeting with you, and with all elected officials, you promised us a whole lot. You said you were going to do this, A, B, and C. And, to my amaze, you really did. A lot of it came through, and we were like so amazed. A big part of it had to do with domestic violence, and a lot of it had to do with cultural outreach. So what I would like to find out, I know that in 2018, 2019, there were a lot of programs pertaining to domestic violence, including the new strangulation policies. And we had like this assistant district attorneys coming out to our office for protection orders. What new programs are in store for us as far as domestic violence? Because 2020 has been a standstill, right? There's not much because of the pandemic. But what do we see coming our way in the next term with you?
Well, domestic violence remains a priority because, especially during COVID, we're cooped up in our homes. Our family problems sometimes seem exacerbated when we can't get distance between ourselves. And I think this, along with the stressors of the economy and our general world health, the natural disasters that we've seen, they've upped the ante, if you will, in terms of the chances of domestic violence happening. Perhaps they haven't even happened before. Also, elder abuse, animal abuse, these are additional family members, right? And we're seeing an uptick in those crimes. So what we do to address it has to be smart and it has to be operationally sound. Like cultural outreach, before we provided it in person where the victims were. We brought, in effect, the system to the victim. We're going to have to do that through technology. And I don't believe that we should stop or slow down. In fact, I think we should increase our outreach, violence, senior citizens, and those interested in animal welfare through technology. We can see that telemedicine can be effective. It's not a substitute for a physical visit to the doctor, and yet in non-essential cases, it can work. The justice system is the same. I believe we can gain protection for people through the use of technology. So outreach, continued emphasis by me with our staff on diversity, employability, and benefits like bilingual pay. The more people who speak the more languages, the better we're able to serve our community. So I think you're going to see us trying to make the programs that we've begun work in a sort of new world, if you will, one with less physical closeness, but one that's still dedicated to crime prevention, violence prevention through direct service provision. We're just going to do it through technology. This may require safe places for people to utilize technology near their home, but not in their home. And so I think we're going to have to develop continued public-private partnerships with hosts for safe places to seek legal help. You've provided that before, Bibi, and I think we're going to have to provide it now in a way that is technology sensitive. Who knew that bandwidth would become the most important conversation we have each day? Oh my gosh, my bandwidth isn't sufficient to make my internet connection stable for the important presentation I'm making. So we have to do some things like that, strengthen our ability to support the technology. But that generally has to do with money. And I think when it comes to approaching our elected leaders who fund this system, we have to be collectively willing to say, here's how it will work, here's how much it will cost. And these public-private partnerships have a lot to offer us in government. We need the expertise and I think the benefits that entrepreneurs can bring. They bring it to the business world, and we see commerce transformed continually. Criminal justice system has to do the same thing. So more of the same, cultural outreach, languages spoken, diverse staff, inclusion, and then strong prosecution of violent offenders. When we have offenders who are high risk, it's very important that we work with the police directly to try and prevent what is, to some degree, predictable violence.
I would like to mention something about when you were saying diverse staff. Watched another interview of yours with, I believe it was a fraternity based somewhere in Houston, and you had mentioned that previously the DA of Harris County had recruited specifically from, I believe, U of H and Rice, but you expanded that scope to include TSU as well. Could you speak a little bit more as to why you felt that was important?
I missed your bandwidth failed there for me at the end. Could you repeat your question about, you saw another interview that I talked about expansion of victim services?
No, expansion recruitment efforts for ADAs. And
yes.
before the Harris County DA's office was only recruiting from U of H and Rice, I believe. But then when you came to office, you expanded it to include TSU. And if I recall correctly, you're now a major, Harris County District Attorney's Office is now a major employer with Texas Southern.
Yes, we have three law schools in our city. I never understood why our office didn't hire more lawyers from all three law schools as opposed to University of Houston or South Texas College of Law. So we did reach out to TSU. I've worked with Howard Henderson there. We've given him access to data for their Criminal Justice Institute's research. And in building a relationship, we've reached out through their career development office, expand our recruitment to all three law schools in Houston. But more importantly, we're reaching out across the country, and we are seeing a response from international students and graduates that is very positive. We're the most diverse county in the country, and therefore the DA's office should look like that diverse community. That means more languages, more cultures, and different perspectives on the same issues of criminal justice that we've always faced. What is right? What is wrong? Can we prove it? And I just think it's been a big benefit to the lawyers who worked here previously, who didn't have the expanded perspective of this inclusive diversity. And I think it's a benefit to the young students who are getting a fair shake. They get to compete. And, the Thurgood Marshall School of Law is an excellent institution. There's no reason that we shouldn't have always been inclusive. So we are now. I think that's to the benefit of our whole community.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And speaking of diversity, let's switch gears here a little bit to about recent events in our city and our country, triggered by the killing of Mr. Floyd, made worse by the killing of Miss Taylor in Louisville, and made even worse now by seemingly no justice for Miss Taylor's questionable shooting. Many people are calling this our spring. You had the Arab Spring. This is the American Spring. Miss Ogg, what do you feel you may have done differently if you had Breonna Taylor's case, or what do you think? What are mistakes that were made in that situation?
Well, because I'm evidence-based and I don't have the evidence in that case, I honestly can't speak to it, and I won't. I won't armchair quarterback another lawyer. But I will tell you what we've done in this town. We bring every single police shooting to a grand jury, and we produce all of the evidence. And we allow the grand jury to make a decision about whether a crime occurred, knowing all the different types of offenses that behavior might constitute, and knowing about the defenses to that behavior, such as self-defense. And so we independently attend the aftermath on scene of every police shooting. I have a lawyer and an investigator there. They belong to a division called Civil Rights. I sought and obtained additional prosecutors for this purpose, and their job is tough. They prosecute police officers,
right,
and other public officials, people who work in the school district or hospitals, for violation of people's civil rights. And yet we don't have a Texas law for violating civil rights. We have laws like murder or aggravated assault. It's difficult to bring evidence to a grand jury and convince them that a police officer intended to kill people while on duty. That makes it harder than, for example, prosecuting civil rights, where we would have to simply show that the officer intended to violate their civil rights. We have weaknesses in law that have to be made up for through passionate exercise of our discretion and desire to hold everyone equally accountable under the law. Some have said, I've gone after police officers. Just the opposite. We don't have bias. We work with police officers, but we have allowed all of the evidence in the cases to be presented to grand juries. And so it's communities making the decision. Now, I understand in Breonna Taylor's case, there was a grand jury and being questioned whether all the evidence was presented. And because the grand jury process in Texas is secret, I can't speak to what will happen in Ms. Taylor's town. But I can tell you that the secrecy of the grand jury is designed to protect people who are accused, but it is not designed to promote transparency. And this is a law that I think will be considered heavily in legislatures across the country. So will the liability standards for police officers. So will training for police officers. And I think that as prosecutors, we have a responsibility to ensure fairness, not results. And so in Harris County, we have seen 35 law enforcement officers indicted for different types of crimes, ranging from theft to murder. Had mixed results, some guilty, some not guilty, many still pending. What I want people to know about that is this is our community deciding. This is democracy in action. And this is reform that you are not uniformly in every jurisdiction. And I think that's what is angering people. They're angry because it doesn't happen fast enough. And I understand their frustration. But I can assure the public that I would rather handle their case thoroughly and properly than just quickly. So, we're chipping away at it each day.
Now, when you are prosecuting officers, whether they be with the HCSO or with HPD, our understanding is that there's some level of independence from the police force, from law enforcement itself. Could you speak more about what you've done to maintain that independence and what it looks like?
Yes, and it's an excellent question. There's a lot of controversy surrounding independent review boards and what their power is, what their power isn't, how they're comprised, et cetera. When you compare the criminal justice system to an independent board, I think you get more of what the public is looking for. Randomly selected people sit on a grand jury. It's true, they have to answer jury service, but they are randomly selected. This was not the case for decades in Texas. And that has been the biggest change in terms of independent review of the evidence. What we've done to keep our prosecutors separate from the police is that while we obtain a lot of evidence from the police, it is not the only evidence we obtain. We've made ourselves open to the public. So the public perhaps distrust the police department and they would prefer to turn in evidence, as they did in the Denny's killing of Mr. Hernandez. I was trying to recall the victim's name. The public brought us that evidence directly, and we utilized it to prosecute, and we obtained a murder verdict and a 25-year sentence in Mr. Hernandez's killer's case against Terry Thompson. One, we go to the scene and we obtain evidence from the police when they're finally concluded pulling it together. So that takes a long time sometimes. But I want the public to know that they can deliver us evidence directly. They can work with our civil rights group independently of police when they have witnesses. and that we are open to that and to presenting those witnesses evidence to grand juries. And I think that makes a big difference. Finally, I support many of the reforms that are being pushed with regard to police unions. The way contracts are negotiated with police unions, the length of time that they have to make a statement, the ability to see their on cameras, I'm opposed to that. I think that those contracts need to be transparent and that the public ought to have the ability to weigh in on those contracts, because they bind our mayor and police chief and at times our legislature to things that the public really doesn't or may not agree with.
It may not be in the interest of the public at all.
That's correct.
Right.
When contracts are negotiated, they're negotiated by parties for the interest of the parties. So I think that being transparent about how these investigations are handled is really important. And saying you're independent is one thing. Being independent is another. I'll give you a final example. The president of the Houston Police Officers Union declared the Harding Street drug raid or debacle as an affront to police. And he labeled the victims, Regina Nicholas and Dennis Tuttle, as dirtbags. None of that was true. They were ordinary people sitting in their home in the middle of the afternoon when a well-armed drug team burst through their door. And it was all based on lies told an officer to a judge as part of a warrant, a no-knock warrant. We did not make a public statement about that case for the entire first 14 months until we filed charges against Gerald Goins. I didn't support the police. I didn't didn't comment on what the chief or anybody had said, because we're evidence-based and it was going before a grand jury, and it still is. And so those are examples of, we continue to work with the police. I often am in communication with the sheriff, with constables, with Chief Art Acevedo, and we get along. I think it's important people know we work together at almost all times, but we have very different jobs. And the DA is ultimately a check and balance on police, just like the judiciary is a check and balance on the DA. And the public holds us all accountable because we're elected. So I think, participating in your democracy is something at times the international community understands and does better than the American public in general. And I love the international community for that. And I appreciate the contributions that you make to our civic development and growth. We believe in the First Amendment, but I believe in action. And I've seen our international community step up and stand out when it really counts. And I appreciate that.
Speaking of, you're just continuing along police reform, moving into an issue that we receive many questions about, and we'd love to know what your stance has been as the Harris County District Attorney. Sentencingproject.org, which is a very famous organization, I'm sure you've heard of them, put out a stat recently that said 1 in 3 Black men born in 2001 can expect to go to prison in their lifetime. Ms. Ogg, what role does the Harris County District Attorney play in ensuring fair sentencing, but also ensuring equitable sentencing, irrespective of minorities, irrespective of color, immigration status, gender, or sexual orientation?
It doesn't begin at sentencing. To solve this problem, we have to start a lot earlier. Obviously, we need better health care for women who are pregnant. We need better education. We especially need assistance in beating back poverty and hunger and things that drive and keep communities vulnerable and at risk. And we need a federal government, by the way, that doesn't terrorize our immigrant communities with fear of deportation. In that same regard, I think it's important that folks understand they're going to have to change. And policing is going to be a difficult culture to change. How do we know that? Because we can see how violently certain law enforcement entities are reacting to the notion of change. I don't look at criminal justice reform as a threat. I see it as a promise of improvement. And I talk with law enforcement about that. But they are, to a large degree, resistant to cultural change. Why does this matter? If the culture is biased against Black and brown communities, and we couple it with drug enforcement, for example, the largest piece of policing and prosecution, you have bad effects, and you get a disproportionate number of Black and brown people being prosecuted or being policed and then prosecuted and ultimately sentenced by courts. What we have to consider is how we enforce narcotics. Is this a priority for our public? I hear them saying they would rather their robberies and burglaries and rapes be solved and the perpetrators brought to justice rather than searching through minority kids' pockets for a crack pipe. So I've done many things to implement drug policy change, and I think that has a disproportionate benefit to minority communities, because this is where the greatest amount of bias in our system is seen. When it comes to crimes of violence, I don't believe any one culture, race, gender is more likely than the other to commit violence. Those are personal, and that's more about personal accountability and decisions that are made. And certainly mitigation can exist when people come from a terrible childhood or abuse themselves, but it's not an excuse. And I don't believe that the public is saying we don't get a fair shake there. Although you see so many victims of color, their cases are not sometimes as aggressively policed. This is wrong. This is also inherent bias. So we must be conscious, I think, of behavior and get out of this notion of identity is good or bad. And I think that's ingrained a lot in the justice system. We get a very myopic view, and police see so much negative. They get that view that people are either good or bad. It's behavior that's good or bad. So if we start earlier, we can stop disproportionate policing. We can improve the status of vulnerable communities and poor communities. And I think that we can look at police and prosecuting policies related to drug enforcement and change those and rid ourselves of a lot of the current bias in the system. And then we just have to work toward fairness in every other category. But it's about 30 to 40% of our docket, drug crimes are. This is far too high. And I think what people want is they want to be protected by their system, not over-policed.
Okay, so I have a question that I would like to ask. It's with Harris County so diverse as far as culture and race and everything goes. And with the debate that happened the other day when the president was asked to condemn white supremacy, it was like pulling, I don't know, I don't know what it was with him, but he was not able to do that. I wanted to find out what your stand are, along with like the Muslim community, other faith community, other, color, race, everything. Where do you and where does your office stand on that?
We look at crimes motivated by individuals' identities as hate crimes. And there's truly a difference between a hate crime and a crime that's motivated, let's say, by opportunity or fueled by drugs or alcohol. Hate crimes represent an attack on an identity group of people. They're meant to frighten by hurting one person of Muslim faith or Mexican descent or that's Black or who's gay. It is meant as a warning, I think, when it's motivated by the victim's identity, the violence against them. That crime is meant to send a message to the rest of us in that group that, boy, we better not get out of line, or boy, we should be afraid. And so I've taken a super hard line on filing hate crimes. If there's any indication that that's the motive, we go ahead and file it directly as a hate crime. I still find that there's an absence of reporting, that police at times fail to include a victim's assertion that I think they picked me because I'm gay, a woman, Black, whatever. I think there's a failure in reporting. Not that it's always intentional, but perhaps they're not trained to listen to the importance. So we're trying to increase awareness in police and prosecutorial culture that it's important. Yes, it may include additional evidence that's needed to prove it, but the crime is worse than the average crime against one individual because it's meant to send a violent message, a message of fear and hate to others. This is bad for our country. This is not public safety, and I don't want to live that way, and I don't want you to live that way.
Even if it's an uphill battle, you'll focus on prosecuting a hate crime as a hate crime?
Yes. That's the trick, is the evidence. And
so proving the intent.
Well, it's because intent is in a person's mind.
Right.
Unless they say something. I'm killing you because you're Muslim. I'm attacking your wife because she's whatever. It's hard to, you have to deduce it from the evidence. But white supremacists make a lot of statements about themselves on Facebook, on social media, through nonverbal communication, their tattoos. And sometimes they will yell or say something during a crime that shows they are a supremacist or believing that vulnerable other communities are not somehow worthy or as worthy of protection under the law. It's a despicable, discriminatory, and violent danger that I think Muslim communities really face a disproportionate amount of that. And so while I hope communities of color and international cultures are putting out awareness about putting out information to increase the average American's understanding, I'm trying to send the message that hate won't be tolerated. And we're going to bring the full force of the law against you if you commit violence in the name of hate.
So,
oh, go ahead, David.
A quick follow-up on that. I think during your time, I think I was told that you had hired the first hate crime district attorney. I think that I remember hearing that. Can you tell us, like, from that time to now, how many hate crimes were actually brought into the court?
I did not assign anyone to hate crimes. They're all over the board, from assault to fraud to domestic violence. So I didn't assign anyone. We had training on it. We established written policies for our intake division. I think we filed 11, and I apologize for not having the exact number. It's hard to know. It's sort of a moving target. And again, like with police prosecutions, I think it's kind of a mixed bag, the results. Some guilty, some not guilty, many pending. We have so many pending cases and such a ridiculous backlog. That's a question of how we're going to get out from under. But I think we're going to do it with technology. Same as reaching our vulnerable populations during COVID. We just can't stop providing services and hope that people will be okay. They need them more than ever. And I think technology is our key. People are resistant to it, but the dinosaurs are resistant to change too.
Could you speak a little bit more about the technology aspect of it? If you could provide a few specifics.
Say that again, Sheree.
Could you provide a little bit more, some more specifics on the technology aspect of it?
Yeah.
Do you mean virtual courtroom hearings?
Yes, we are having virtual courtroom hearings now. We have them each day, every day. We have seen virtual trials occur in Texas and around the country in 2 spots, and they they have concluded that it worked. Our judiciary has not embraced that fully, but they have gone to great lengths to try and make jury service safe. And they've done that by hiring out the NRG arena over by Reliant so that there's social distancing. But I think we should be considering placing witnesses in secure facilities from which they can testify without coming to court. I think we should be able to do that. And it doesn't deprive the accused of their confrontation, but those objections exist. And so because lawyers will make those objections, some courts don't want to do it. It's understandable. I just think that's our way to end this backlog, that we can keep pushing through trials and make them safer through the use of technology for witnesses, victims, and even perhaps jurors. You could have individual booths for people to serve in. I think it's possible to push our way out and through this backlog. It's going to take some time. It's going to take more people. But where there's a will, there's a way.
Switching gears a little bit, talking about education, but specifically focusing on the school to prison pipeline. Ms. Ogg, if you could tell us a little bit more about your stance on the school to prison pipeline, and possibly one concrete step or policy item you've taken to combat the school to prison pipeline. Because we know if a student is arrested in high school, they're 50% more likely to drop out before graduation. Many students are arrested due to petty misconduct in school, and they're either sent to juvie or arrested and tried as an adult at the age of 17. And so this is known as the school to prison pipeline, and it's definitely more nuanced and it has more details to it. But as district attorney of Harris County, the fourth largest county in the country, what is one thing that you've done? What is one policy item or step that you've taken to combat the school to prison pipeline?
We've reduced the number of cases filed against juvenile offenders by almost 50%. And we've done that by treating misdemeanor crimes, especially those committed at school, where about half of 5,000 or so cases were occurring. We've stopped accepting charges on those, and we've asked schools and police departments to handle it differently, administratively, and in one area, through the Fifth Ward Development Program, we've funded, by using forfeited drug monies, 2 social workers and a program supervisor to basically provide assistance to the kids from Phyllis Wheatley High School and McReynolds Middle School, Fifth Ward schools, to provide them resources, counseling, and a safe place to come to. That was before COVID. Now they're doing it virtually and in people's homes. But we've stopped filing every childish offense as a crime. And we've asked schools through training and through outreach to the superintendents themselves to join us in this effort to reduce the number of young people being charged and arrested for crimes at school. And they have agreed, and it has reduced our numbers by about 50%. So that was about 5,000 out of about 5,000 cases of the juvenile cases that were misdemeanors. We are aiming for 80% reduction, meaning we would only file weapons or threat type cases, threat of violence cases that happen at school. Sexual assault, also not a misdemeanor. So that's what we're doing. It's concrete, it's real numbers, and it's about, it's closing in on 5,000 fewer young people charged during this administration each year than during past administrations, all the way back to the 80s. And in the 80s, they did not file as many cases. There were a lot more violent crimes happening out in the public. juvenile justice was not used as so much as a hammer. It was used on the worst of the worst. And it just became more and more a focus during the 90s and 2000s, and it had bad results. We see that young people who are placed on probation for extraordinary lengths of time don't really do any better than they would if they hadn't been placed on probation. And we see a much greater increase in risk of them committing additional crimes once they go through the system. So, but for the really serious juvenile crimes, we're just trying to handle them differently.
So would you say by telling law enforcement what you will and what you won't prosecute, or I should say in a different way, the types of cases, the thematic elements of the cases that you won't be prosecuting, maybe possession of marijuana or smaller portions of marijuana, children defending themselves in school bullying issues, that you're able to tell officers indirectly that this isn't an issue even worth pursuing or considering, because I'm not going to do anything about it?
So I don't like that executive and authoritarian approach. I have worked with all 87 law enforcement agencies in Harris County. That was the first promise I kept, was to work with law enforcement to stop prosecuting possession of marijuana for everyone in misdemeanor amounts, not felony amounts, and not delivery, but anything under 4 ounces. And they agreed. All of the law enforcement chiefs agreed. It gave their officers much more time to handle more serious cases rather than being detained 4 hours, making a misdemeanor Class B arrest of somebody who then would get a record and have fewer job opportunities, education opportunities, et cetera. So I prefer to work with them. I work with the leaders. We negotiate. It's uncomfortable. It's often, I'm a woman. Law enforcement is not, the upper ranks of power are not filled with women. They are certainly not filled with LGBTQ women, which I am. And so it's uncomfortable at times when I'm pushing reform, which I see as improvement, and they see as culture change, or sometimes they'll suggest that it's got a negative public safety impact. I listen to that. Example, in working with them to stop prosecuting marijuana, they felt like it was important to continue filing the cases that happened at school. So we did, until we reached an agreement not to. And that happened about 1.5 years ago. So I think that working with law enforcement as the top law enforcement official, which I am, even though I'm not a first responder or a policeman, that's my role. And I think that if I use executive fiat, people don't like that, especially in Texas. Nobody likes to be told here what to do. We'd prefer you work with us and we'll see what we can work out. And so far, that's worked. Now, my opponent is a staff lawyer for the police union. And so there's been some sharp jabs and elbows thrown in that race. But I think all of us in politics can expect that. And that it's important to, be able to roll with that and answer to the public. So, Paul, it's not a perfect relationship with law enforcement, and it can be uncomfortable. I'm dedicated to working with them to get these changed policies. One last thing, if we don't work with them, then many of our changes will not work. Law enforcement is who keeps the peace on the street. So we're going to have to work with them to implement the changes that our people want, like no knock warrants,
right?
Less policing for drug crimes in minority communities, more emphasis on trauma-informed response to domestic violence victims, especially if they're from a different culture or even just from a minority community. It's very important that we bring police with us on this journey. It is not us versus them. We are all in this together.
We spoke to Sheriff Ed Gonzalez, I believe it was last week, and then we spoke to Constable Trevor Nels, who spoke about his brother's record on reducing the recidivism rate. Sheriff Gonzalez, as I'm sure you're aware, has several programs throughout the jail program to ensure training workshops and further career opportunities for inmates to ensure that they don't come back into the prison system. Sheriff Troy Nels has done essentially the same thing, and they both worked on situations regarding criminals or people accused of crimes with mental health situations. What role does your office play in reducing the recidivism rate, and how does it specifically pertain to people with issues of mental health?
People with issues of mental health comprise somewhere between 25 and 50% of our criminally charged population, meaning crime has occurred, they've been accused of it, and there's a filed charge. And so we're charged with prosecuting. That's an enormous percentage. We found that we were able to lower recidivism among the nonviolent mentally ill offenders who we were able to divert around the system. Once again, working with law enforcement. So instead of taking a homeless mentally ill person to jail because he's urinating in somebody's parking lot and scaring the customers, they've started taking that same individual to the Ed Emmett Diversion Center. I am a D, Ed Emmett was an R. Bipartisanship has to be what our public officials engage in so that we can move the ball forward. And what we did together, Commissioner's Court with mixed representation, a county judge of one party, a DA of another, a sheriff of another, is we all agreed we would let these low-level, nonviolent, mentally ill, meaning they have a history of mental illness with the old MHMR, which is now called the Harris Center. If they had that, we wouldn't take charges. We would send them to Ed Emmett. And the recidivism rate has dropped dramatically because what we saw with those chronically mentally ill trespassers is that they came back through the system. One person came back 76 times. This is a huge waste of money. We've diverted now 3,000 people, meaning they would have been charged, but the police drove them to the Midtown Center, Ed Emmett Mental Health Diversion Center. They were not charged. The call came into our intake. Our lawyer talked to the policeman on the street. They made a decision together to divert the person. This is criminal justice reform, and it's significant. And tonight, NAMI, the National Association for Mental Illness, right, is weighing in on this race. And we're being interviewed about what we've done to aid the mentally ill and to reduce recidivism. And so I'm really proud of these objective, definable, and statistically they're positive programs and policies. This is what criminal justice reform is. And you just don't fix community trust when we have police shootings. You don't fix victims' lack of trust when we continually have a federal government leader that is threatening deportation if they're seen. So we really have to work together, I think, to dispel fear, increase trust, and we have to do it through programs like I've described to you. And that's why I want to run for district attorney. That's why I enjoy being the district attorney, and that's why I would like to remain the district attorney in this next election.
So one quick question, I just wanted to find out, how often does your staff and assistant district attorneys do workshops and training, like on mental health issues, on cultural issues that happen within our community? How often does that occur?
Our lawyers train. They are only required to get about 15 hours of training a year by the Bar Association. We provide about triple that. We have trainings weekly. Obviously, they don't all include these subjects over and over, but we train on those subjects more than once to the same lawyer as they progress through our employment process, not our employment process, I guess, development process professionally. So they may get a training in 2018 when they're hired and another training when they're trying those types of cases in misdemeanor courts, meaning low-level misdemeanors. They might get some training on it as a misdemeanor prosecutor, again, as a felony prosecutor. So I don't have a plan just for mental illness, but it is injected and part of the training, the overall office training plan and program that's implemented. More importantly, though, we trained the police officers through the permission and by working with the sheriff and the different police chiefs from Acevedo to Brugger and Pasadena. We have access, and our lawyers have gone and trained on all these diversion programs, especially the mental health diversion program with the officers, who, by the way, BB, are frequently skeptical until they become our greatest supporters. So there's a sheriff's deputy who works down at the Mental Health Diversion Center. He's the one who had the idea to start checking the recidivism rates because he saw the change in people. So I just think continued inclusion, especially in a time that's fraught with so much dissension between us. I'm going to continue to promote working together, inclusion, new ways of doing things that focus on technology and basic fairness through evidence-based prosecution.
And for the last question, and thank you for being so generous with your time, how does your faith or your spirituality or your moral compass guide your decision-making skills every single day at the district attorney's office?
The older I get, the more important I understand that our relationship with God is. And I wish that we understood it better when we were youthful, but it's increasingly clear. And as our world changes like it has rapidly and dramatically, I find myself relying upon faith leaders for guidance, upon personal prayer for strength and for clarity and wisdom. And I always fear that we're going to be seen as pushing things with the staff, but I try to focus on well-being mentally as much as physically for our lawyers, and because they have tough jobs and they're traumatic. And seeing murdered people or people whose lives were destroyed in a drunk driving accident, it affects the first responders, but it also has a secondary impact on our lawyers. And dealing with the victims is very important. And I think that our reliance upon spirituality for that type of service, that's the only way we can provide it. I want our lawyers to have heart. To have heart, I hope they have a spiritual component to them, but it's not required. And there may be people who do not share these beliefs, and it's in no way intended to offend you. But my relationship with my higher power is strengthened by my need. I need to make the right decisions. I need the strength to keep going. I need the patience. So, like many people, I pray to God because I need Him. But in truth, I want to do the right thing, and I think that helps.
My name is Sharik Abdulghani. I'm the director of Minaret Foundation, where our focus is to lift American Muslim voices for sustainable change through multi-faith and civic engagement. I'm joined by Bibi Khan, the founder and director of An-Nisa Hope Center, and together we are interviewing Miss Kim Ogg, the Harris County District Attorney, and she's running for re-election this cycle. If you want to learn more about her URL is at the bottom right here. Thank you for being so generous with your time. Ms. Ogg, really appreciate it. Thank you for your honest and open-ended questions or open-ended answers. And we hope to talk to you again soon.
Sharik, Bibi, it's always a pleasure. Thank you for
so much.
this community.